Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about the heart in general, the pericardium, and the wall of the heart. So we know that the main function of the heart is to pump blood. Right? It receives blood and then pumps it out. Okay. So basically there's kind of a double function here, receiving blood and pumping blood. The heart has four chambers to it, or four spaces. There are two upper chambers and two lower chambers. The two upper chambers have the job of receiving the blood, and the two lower chambers have the job of pumping that blood out to other areas of the body. So the upper chambers are called atria, or atrium for singular, and the lower chambers are called ventricles. That's the basic function of the heart. In other videos, I go in a lot more detail about how the heart functions. But now let's talk about some other aspects of the heart. Like we know which organ system it belongs to, right? If you said circulatory or cardiovascular system, that would be correct. How about the location of the heart? We can talk about the location of the heart in different ways. If we were talking about body cavities, we would say that the heart is located in the mediastinum, which is inside the thoracic cavity, which is inside the ventral body cavity. So the mediastinum is just the space between our right and left lung. Heart is located in there, along with some other organs like the esophagus, trachea, and other things. We can also talk about the location of the heart in terms of bony landmarks. So the heart is located posterior to the sternum, okay, and it's slightly to the left, and it's roughly located between the third and the fifth rib. If we're talking about what do we find next to and below the heart is where we will find the diaphragm, which is our main muscle of breathing. And to the right and left of the heart is where we find the lungs. How is the heart protected? What sort of protection does the heart have, right? Well, obviously the bones protect the heart. So the sternum and the ribs give lateral and anterior protection to the heart. And then in the back, we have vertebrae that protect the heart and muscles, layers of tissue, obviously, from the back that are going to protect the heart. But there's something called the pericardium, which also protects the heart, but it's mostly protecting the heart from friction. So let's take a look at that pericardium. The pericardium is a membrane system covering the outside of the heart. The pericardium is a type of membrane called a serous membrane. Other serous membranes include the pleural membranes around the lungs and the peritoneal membranes in the abdominal cavity. But we're concentrating here on the pericardium. So when we say a membrane, we're talking about a sheet-like structure. So this is, something you can see with your naked eye. This is a gross anatomical structure. And it's a sheet-like structure made of epithelial tissue and connective tissues. So the pericardium has some different layers to it, and there's a space actually too. So the outermost layer is called the fibrous pericardium, and as the name suggests, there's a lot of fibers in there. Deep to the fibrous pericardium is where we're going to find the true serous membrane. So serous membranes have two layers with a space in between. Okay. So inside the cavity, inside that space, we're going to have a fluid. And this fluid is what's going to help reduce the friction. So every time the heart beats, it's moving, right? And there's a potential for friction. So this fluid helps to reduce friction whenever the heart beats. So let's take a closer look at that pericardium. So as I mentioned, the outermost layer is the fibrous pericardium, and it's mostly made of connective tissue. So on the picture here, you can see the fibrous pericardium more close up in an artist rendition, and it's labeled number 4, okay? So 3, 2, and 1, that's our true serous membrane, okay? We have the two layers and the space in between. So when it comes to serous membranes, there's this pattern that they follow. There's a parietal layer, a cavity, and then a visceral layer to the serous membrane. The parietal layer is always the more outermost layer of the serous membrane. The visceral layer, visceral means guts. The visceral layer lies right on the guts, so it's the deepest layer to the serous membrane. And the space, also called a cavity, is between the parietal and visceral layers. So in the picture here, number 3 is the parietal pericardium, right? So it's just a thin layer of simple squamous epithelial tissue that's between the fibrous pericardium and the cavity. The cavity is called the pericardial cavity, and it's filled with a fluid that we call pericardial fluid. And as we said before, This is there to reduce friction. The deepest layer of the pericardium is the visceral pericardium, and it has another common name that you need to know. It's also called the epicardium, okay? So this layer of the pericardium also makes up the most outermost layer to the wall of the heart. So this is a point of confusion for students, right? We think of the pericardium as being these layers of membranes on the outside of the heart, which is partially true. But one part of the pericardium is also a part of the wall of the heart itself, and that's the visceral pericardium or epicardium. And this is also made of simple squamous epithelial tissue. Now let's take a look at the wall of the heart. So the heart is a hollow organ, but all hollow organs have a wall to them, right? So we're talking about the layers in the wall of the heart. So there are 3 layers here. The most superficial layer is the epicardium, also known as the visceral pericardium. This is the one we just talked about. We said it is both a layer to the serous membrane and part of the wall of the heart, which students find confusing. The tissue that we find here is simple squamous epithelial tissue. This layer is the layer that actually makes the serous fluid that we find in the pericardial cavity. Just deep to that, we find the bulk of the wall of the heart, which is called the myocardium. This is actually the cardiac muscle tissue that is going to contract to push blood through the heart, or push blood through the body, really. And then the innermost layer is called the endocardium, endo meaning most inside, right? It's also sometimes referred to as the endothelium. So the endocardium is also made of simple squamous epithelial tissue like the epicardium. And here that tissue is really important because it has to be really smooth and slippery, almost like glass. And that's because we don't want any platelets to stick to it, because then we can start unwanted clotting inside the heart. So don't forget, platelets stick to anything that's bumpy or rough. So we need this to be nice and smooth. This endocardium is continuous with the lining on the inside of all of our blood vessels, and that is called the endothelium, and it's also simple squamous epithelial tissue. So sometimes people will call the endocardium the endothelium, and that's fine, but typically it's referred to as endocardium. All right, so pause the video here, see if you can answer these review questions. Once you're finished, go ahead and press play so you can check your answers.